Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're extremely pleased to have you all here this afternoon at Maison Française, which is your house this afternoon. And we're honored to have with us to introduce our speakers, Ambassador Philippe Etienne, whom I know is not an occasional or amateur scholar of French-American history, but a real scholar in his own way of our common history. And he's all the more appropriate as your host in this house, but also as someone who is absolutely fascinated and generates a lot of interest throughout our communities in our common history. Monsieur l'Ambassadeur.
Thank you very much, Vincent. I love to be introduced this way because indeed it's my passion. And for this reason I am so happy to be here with you. Good afternoon, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. What a pleasure indeed to welcome you all this afternoon to La Maison Française for this special event on France's role in the American Revolutionary War. As you will see with our extraordinary guests, it's not only a very classical subject, but it's also a very active topic for the best researchers and scholars. In particular, we are honored to have with us today Dr. Iris de Rode, an extremely talented scholar, historian, and writer, who recently published an exciting biography of the so-called soldier philosopher, François-Jean de Châtelus. And she will tell us more about him shortly. Although he is little known today, not only did François-Jean de Châtelus play a key role in the Franco-American alliance on the eve of American independence, but his efforts encompassed multiple fields, military, but also, I would say, diplomatic, political, trade, intellectual, scientific, and he is a perfect illustration of the friendship and solidarity that our countries have shared ever since the Revolutionary War. I really advise you to read the book written by Iris. It's a fascinating book, as fascinating as the history of the discovery of the correspondence between Châtelus and Washington. France and the US, as you know, as we know, were both inspired by the great French Enlightenment philosophers. And they were both influenced by America's founding fathers, including some of them who were, by the way, ambassadors of the young republic to France. Not only Thomas Jefferson, but also James Monroe and many others, before becoming presidents of the United States. While we are on the topic of notable students of the Enlightenment, it so happens that François-Jean de Châtelus was directly related to one of them. I'm speaking here of the Marquis de Lafayette, who married François-Jean's cousin, Adrienne de Noailles. The two men spent a lot of time together, both in Paris, before they left for the US, for America, and also once they had arrived here, where they studied American geography and historic battlefields together in the winter of 1780-1781, before the major and final battle at Yorktown. Given that George Washington and Marquis de Lafayette were key figures at the time, I would like to share at the end of this short introduction some quotes from them in order, in trying to introduce this afternoon's event and give you a preview of the main topics that we will be discussing. In 1777, Marquis de Lafayette wrote, I quote, "The happiness of America is intimately connected with the happiness of all mankind. She is destined to become the safe and venerable asylum of virtue, of honesty, of tolerance, and of peaceful liberty." End of quote. And in 1786, George Washington wrote Marquis de Lafayette saying, I quote, "I am happy in a conviction that there may be established between France and the US and the United States of America such a mutual intercourse of good offices and reciprocal interests as cannot fail to be attended with the happiest consequences." You will understand why I'm so interested and happy to be able to read these quotes as we are preparing for the upcoming state visit of the President of France, Emmanuel Macron, who has been invited to the state visit by the President of the United States, Joe Biden, for the first state visit of his mandate. This state visit will take place at the beginning of December. I would like to thank everyone who has partnered with us on this event, especially George Washington's Mount Vernon and its President and CEO, Dr. Douglas Bradburn, but also the American Friends of Lafayette, the Lafayette Trail, and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And I am particularly honored and proud to welcome here this afternoon, to welcome you, dear Douglas, dear President, having been so warmly welcomed many times in Mount Vernon at the very beginning of my tenure as ambassador 3.5 years ago, and again on another Bastille Day, 14th of July this year, for the inauguration of the restored bedroom of Lafayette in Mount Vernon. Thank you very much for everything you are doing, not only for your country through this great institution of Mount Vernon, but also for the friendship and the cooperation between the United States and France. I give you the floor. Thank you very much. I wish you a very good event.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Delighted to be here as your guest, and thank you all so much for being here. I'm Doug Bradburn, the President and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon, and we thought that video would help speak for the importance of the wonderful conference we held in 2019. And I know that we had tried in 2020 to come here and do a little bit of an update on the state of the scholarship, on the wonderful ties between France and the United States, going back to the very founding of the Republic of the United States and the Great Revolution, of course, which created the birth of modern France as well. And of course, it couldn't happen because of COVID. But I'm delighted to be here today to give you a piece of that conference and to give you an update, a little bit of an update. But the real star of the show will be Iris, who you've heard about. And I want to take us back a little bit to think about why Mount Vernon is so engaged. Obviously, the relationship of the French to Mount Vernon goes back to George Washington's close relationship with the French Army and the American officer, the Marquis de Lafayette, as well. But more recently, this more recent effort to be involved in scholarship has become very important. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association opened a research library, the Presidential Library for George Washington, in 2013. And we were aggressively growing our collections of materials related to the founding of the United States and George Washington. And in fact, it was in December of 2016 when the Christie's auction came up, and there were these mysterious letters in that auction between George Washington and the Marquis de Châteauroux, a collection that was long thought lost. And we were able to acquire 5 letters in that initial auction. But it was a big mystery to us where these had come from and how they were for sale. And I was able at that time to discover that there was this Dutch scholar who was working on Châteauroux in graduate school and reached out and found out that she was the one who had discovered this lost archive. And you're going to hear all about that. We acquired these 5 letters in 2016. We acquired another in 2017. There's an incredible collection of items that came out. These are wonderful letters. George Washington keeps everyone at arm's length, except for his bosom friends. He doesn't really go into his own philosophies very often. He doesn't go into his hopes and dreams very often. And so when he does, they are remarkable. And I'm happy to say that with the Marquis de Châteauroux, who was his very close friend, he expressed his personal feelings and philosophies and hopes, his hope for retirement, to live under his own vine and fig tree, his notion that he hoped that peace would characterize the future relations of America and France, and indeed all of Europe, and his rare joke in a letter that we acquired to the Marquis de Châteauroux when he heard that the Marquis had recently been married. And he said, "You have a wife, my dear Marquis, like the plague and the smallpox. It's something you can only have once in your life." So, unusual joke from George Washington. And of course, there's the extraordinary letter in which George Washington wrote, "Never in my life did I part with a man to whom my soul clave more sincerely than it did to you." This was his best friend through the revolution itself. So these acquisitions, built on by the state visit of President Macron, who came to Mount Vernon in April of 2018 with President Trump, highlighting the Franco-American relationship. I'm wearing my Bastille key tie that we sell at Mount Vernon, which you can go and find online, I'm sure. It highlights that long relationship. All confirmed that we wanted to hold an extraordinary major conference in Paris commemorating the 240 years of American and French friendship and partnership. We partnered with the University of Paris 8. We celebrated the new work of historians, both accomplished and junior scholars from France, Europe, and the United States, on the French role in American independence. We explored such topics as the French Army in America, early American diplomacy, the sophistication of French engineering and mapping that aided in the success of the War for Independence, Franco-American commerce, political thought, and the material culture and the arts. And we combined these scholarly presentations with conversations on the present state at the time of French-American relations. We had a wonderful culinary diplomacy presentation with the American ambassador to France. And we also had a conversation on the state of NATO and its relations with the United States in 2019, which indeed was quite different, I think, in 2019 than it is today. The perspective of history, of course, is critical in understanding that events can often clarify important interests and relationships. And I think the ambassador would agree with me that the tragic and illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine that has so dominated our relationship in this last year has had one good outcome, is that it clarified very powerfully the shared values and interests of the people of France, the United States, and all of the EU. And I particularly would like to thank the ambassador and President Macron and the people of France for their leadership in rallying and strengthening the spine of NATO in their response, an aggressive response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So thank you, sir, very much for that leadership here in Washington. So the conference particularly highlighted Iris de Roodt and her discovery of this archive, which you're going to hear about very much. You saw in that video that we were able to tour with Hugues and Sophie de Châteloup. Their archives with François-Jean de Châteloup are kept. This is an archive that really no scholars have been able to use, with the exception of Iris. She is indeed also happily known as the discovery of Major General Villemille's archive as well. So 5,000 items in the Châteloup archive, who was third in command of Rochambeau's army. Another 1,000 items in Villemille's archive, who was second in command. And these two archives never been seen by scholars until Iris came around. It is incredibly rare for those of us who study the era of the American Revolution to have such a trove, a wealth of new knowledge presented to us. And I am delighted to announce today, the first public announcement of this, that both of these archives will be digitized and available for researchers at Mount Vernon at our library. But we just signed the deal. Excellent. We thank the Richard Lounsbury Foundation, which has made that possible. But so let's go ahead and finish up and welcome Iris, and she can tell us all about these remarkable men of the Revolution that are often not well known. You know, it's our mission to tell these stories because at a time when the world is fighting for critical values, it's important that we understand our shared history that goes so deeply into our united past. So thank you very much for letting me be here. Let's welcome Iris to the stage.
Yes. So hello. Thank you very much to Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, for this invitation, for the entire team for organizing this conference, and of course also to Doug to always support the research about Châteloup and the others. And thank you all for coming today, and I see a lot of familiar faces, or I can't really see you now with the light, but thank you for coming. So I am here today to present my book, of course, called François-Jean, un soldat philosophe dans le monde atlantique à l'époque des Lumières. Very long title, because it's based on a French dissertation. But so I will tell you the story first of the discovery of the Châteloup archive, as has been well introduced, of course, by Monsieur l'Ambassadeur and Doug. And so it all started in the garden of my parents' home in Burgundy. So I am Dutch, but they bought a home at one point in this place, and so you can see that there is a very large tree in our garden. This tree is called in French the tulipier de Virginie, so that is a tulip tree from Virginia. And according to the little legend in the village where I grew up, it was planted by Lafayette himself. So when I grew up, I was convinced it was, of course, Lafayette. But then I started to do some research. And it appeared that it was not Lafayette, but that uncle we already spoke about, or his uncle by marriage, called François-Jean de Châteloup. And so, well, I'm just trying to make it a little more fun. But so here is him, Châteloup. Now you can see his portrait. But so François-Jean de Châteloup was living close by to the place where I grew up. And so he apparently, the person living in our home, had given some money to the cause of the American Revolution, as some of these noblemen did at the time. And as a gift to him, François-Jean de Châteloup brought an American tree This is something that happened quite often at the time because there was a lot of botanical exchange happening. During, of course, time of the Enlightenment, people were very curious to find out more about nature in America. And so this tree, the tulip poplar tree from Virginia, was planted in that garden. And so about 250 years after, I just found out that there was this man who planted, or at least gave it to the person living in our home. And I had no idea who François-Jean de Châtelus was, but I did know that there was a village close by called Châtelus. And you've already seen it on the screen. This thing's not working anymore, but maybe if I turn it off and on. But so it led to the castle of Châtelus that you have already seen on the image somewhere and might work again. But it would be nice if it could work because all these slides. But anyway, so the castle so there's a village called Châtelus, so I went to Châtelus and thought maybe there's something to find. So there was a huge castle standing in the village of Châtelus, and here we go. So I wanted to say that they were family, but that has already been mentioned, but so I'll just skip this part. But so here's the Château de Châtelus. So as I said, I knew that there was a village close by called Châtelus, but I didn't know the rest of the story. But so when I went to the castle and met the current owner, Philippe de Châtelus, he told me about, indeed, his ancestor called François-Jean. He's holding his portrait on this photo, and told me more about him. And this really sparked my curiosity because he gave me a travel diary that Châtelus had written in between 1780 and 83, that some of you might know because it's a published travel diary, in which he describes his travels through America during the American Revolution. He visited several states and describes almost everything he's done there, but he also is describing, for instance, the culture, the religion, the different political constitutions per state. And so he's really traveling kind of like Tocqueville before Tocqueville, we could say. And so I was very inspired by this and wanted to know more about Châtelus. So I went to a few archives in Paris, some others in the United States too, to figure out if there was more to find about Châtelus. And it appeared that there was quite some material, but there was almost nothing written to him. It was always written by him. And so I was wondering if maybe the collection of the Châtelus castle could have some documents on Châtelus. And so when I went back to Philippe, after a few years actually, I asked him, do you have archives in the castle? Because it seems that there is just not enough to be found on François-Jean Châtelus. And then he told me about his archive tower. This archive tower, you can see actually on the slide, this slide. It's the square tower that you can see on the back, on the one on the right. So you can see a square tower, that's where the archive is kept. And so he told me that he'd never really looked for it because his family archive is kept there and starts in 1328 up until today. So it's a very large collection. As you can imagine, it's all the papers of all the family members from that period onwards. And so Philippe just told me he was a little overwhelmed by the collection and he had never specifically looked for François-Jean's specific papers. But so when we were looking for it together, we really found this treasure. So when we opened the box, you have to imagine it's a big tower. You have to go on a spiral stair, and when you enter, you have very large sort of piles of different boxes, and one of the big boxes of steel and wood was François-Jean Châtelus. It was written on it, his name. So when we opened this, a lot of dust came out and dead flies. But there was also a lot of letters, of course. And so one of the first ones we opened was just written by hand, George Washington. So I thought, let's open it. And there were actually a lot of letters, 8 letters of George Washington himself that wrote to Châtelus of the period of the 1780s. And of course, at first, when you open something like that, you're like, is this real? Is this a real letter? And yes, it was. Also, Philippe told me that no one had ever really opened them since, so it kind of couldn't be not true. And then also we opened the next ones. It was Jefferson, it was Adams' letters, Thomas Paine's letters. And then another part was Jeremy Bentham, David Hume. Another part was Voltaire and d'Alembert, Diderot, the French philosophers. And so it really gives a very large selection of his entire correspondence with the people of the Enlightenment, the philosophers of the Enlightenment, with the officers, of course, of the French army, but also of the American, the Continental Army. And it also gives you a good image of this European sort of enlightenment of the time in which he played an important part. And so here you can see again these images that were already in the video too. But so we visited this with this Mount Vernon travel in 2019. But here you can see where it's kept today. It's in a library. So what the family has decided when they knew they had this collection is that they put it somewhere else. So they wanted to put it in a more safe place, in a smaller place with little less dust especially, in this home of the person you can see there, Hugues de Chatelue. And so now it's kept there, and some of the more important documents are, by the way, in a safe, so they're preserved in a better way. But you can see how large it is. There is about 5,000 pages of his entire collection, coming from the 7 Years' War, in which he was fighting as an officer, up until the end of his life, which was in 1788. So 1788, of course, being just before the outbreak of the French Revolution. Because everyone's always wondering what he did there. Well, not much. So, so here we can see some of the highlights, of course, George Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin's letters. But of course also Lafayette himself, Rochambeau, and La Luzerne. La Luzerne is the one I want to focus on today, because La Luzerne was the French ambassador that was representing, of course, the court of France during the campaign of Rochambeau. And of course, because we're today at the French embassy, and of course to honor the ambassador of today, that of course plays an equal important role for today's world. But La Luzerne played an important role, as we will see, in the American Revolution, together with Chatelue. Some other highlights are the maps that Chatelue had kept. Oh, this is the next slide. But so there's a lot of material on the American Revolution that's quite surprising, because it also holds papers of the period before, because Chatelue was, before he came with Rochambeau in 1780, because he was collecting maps and information on the battles that were previously fought so that he could fight them himself. And so what did I do with all this? So I was wondering, first of all, why does he have this large correspondence? How is he kind of unknown? Some historians do know him, of course, because of his travel diary and because of the letters that he had sent or received. But overall, he's quite the unknown person. It's symbolized by this paintings where he's really standing in the back of the others. You can see Lafayette, Washington, Rochambeau, and Tillman, and then Chatelue with the little arrow, and Lincoln next to them. And so I was actually wondering, why is he on these paintings? Why is he on this very famous painting? And especially, how could he be so connected to all these philosophers, the founding fathers of the United States, but also this European network? So that's why I just wanted to reconstruct his entire life to understand the role he would later play in America. Why did the people here in the United States welcome him so much, and why would they become so befriended, as Doug has shown, with George Washington? And one of the main reasons I was wondering this is the letter that Doug has referred to about the deep friendship between these two gentlemen. So between 1780 and 83, George Washington and Chatelue met quite frequently, and they stayed in correspondence afterwards, hence all these letters. But so you can see on this slide how George Washington felt towards Chatelue. So Chatelue left at the end of 82, or at least in 83, but so this is the farewell letter that Washington writes to him just after the campaign, that they fought, of course, together. And so he expresses himself with I can truly say that never in my life did I part with a man to whom my soul clave more sincerely than it did to you. And this is a very unusual tone, such as the funny letters too, but it's an unusual tone for George Washington, so it could be considered quite sincere, this friendship. And so all these things made me just wonder about the rest of Chatelue's life. And here we go, the slides start to not work anymore again. But so that's why I decided to, as I said, write a full biography on Chatelue to try to understand why he could play this role in the United States, but especially also the rest of his life was important to understand that. So that led to my dissertation, which is my next slide. But so I see something happen. Here we go. I wrote a biography about Chatelue. And so this is the PhD dissertation, and then this is the book that I am presenting today. So this is in French, so I'm sorry for those that don't read French, but I'm writing the English book now, which is based on this research, but that's also based on new research that I have additionally done. And the main difference is also that this book is 720 pages, because of course it's based on a dissertation in French, which requires a large number of pages. But so now I'm writing the English version, which will be half that much, and which will include other figures, such as that ambassador La Luzerne, in the story of the French in the American Revolution. And so now I will tell you who Châteauneuf was, and then we're going to dive a little deeper into this relationship he had with La Luzerne, and especially what the French ambassador and Châteauneuf did for the independence of the United States. So to introduce Châteauneuf, this is a good quote, because Franklin did identify something in him, as we can see here in 1782, so after Yorktown. Benjamin Franklin wrote to Châteauneuf, here you can see, so I congratulate you on the success of the last glorious campaign, referring obviously to Yorktown. Then he says, a philosopher endowed with those strong sentiments of humanity that are manifested in your excellent writings must enjoy great satisfaction in having contributed so extensively by his sword as well as by his pen to public happiness. So we can see there's writing, there's a sword, and there's a pen. And that exactly summarizes Châteauneuf, who was indeed fighting as an officer, as I already mentioned, in the 7 Years' War. So that is that war from 1756 until 63, of course, where Châteauneuf was fighting in the German theater of the war. There was an American one, he wasn't part of that. But so he was one of the officers. He started, he was quite young when he started, but he moved up to have his own regiment called the Régiment de Châteauneuf. And so, of course, France lost very badly in this war. They lost their American colonies, and it would be one of the inspirations for the French to join the Americans in their cause of independence, because of course they wanted to weaken their enemy, of which they lost so badly during this 7 Years' War. But so what's interesting during the 7 Years' War is that Châteauneuf, of course, got a lot of the skills that he would apply later in the American Revolution, but he was also fighting alongside 3 people. So the first is Rochambeau himself. They fought in quite a lot of campaigns together. They even switched regiments, so Châteauneuf became the colonel of one of the regiments and vice versa. And he also fought with La Luzerne. So La Luzerne, before being an ambassador, was a French officer as well that started his career in the 7 Years' War. And then the third person was Vioménil, that person that we just discussed briefly, who was also the second in command afterwards in Rochambeau's campaign, of whom I've just found his archive as well. And so what's interesting about this group is that they all sort of got their skills, their military experience in this war, and they would work together again in America. So there was another part of the quote of Franklin being the pen. So it's true that Châteauneuf, in the times that he was not in battle, he was working a lot on writings. So he was writing many books. He's written about 20 different books about a very large variety of subjects. He started with a book on the inoculation against the smallpox. That was his first publication, and then started to publish a lot about music, about poetry, as you can see here. He wrote 7 theater plays that were all performed at the time. He also wrote especially his main, what you could call a bestseller at the time, called De la Félicité Publique, which is in English, On Public Happiness. Of course, a very enlightened book about what happiness meant, and especially which periods in history people have been most happy under which type of government. This is an important book at the time because it was also translated in English and circulated already in the young United States before Châteauneuf would arrive. One of the reasons people knew him at the time, and especially Washington knew him because of it too, but for instance, when Châteauneuf arrived, he received a letter of Thomas Jefferson saying that he wanted to meet him because he was so curious to know who the author of this treatise was. And then you see at the end the Voyage of Châteauneuf being his travel diary that I spoke about at the beginning. And so Châteauneuf, you could consider him a soldier philosopher, as is in the title of the book, which is someone who's combining the enlightened thought in order to wage war. So he was studying what they called the art of war in a scientific, rational way, and that makes Châteauneuf one of these soldier philosophers that played an important role at the end of the 18th century in France to reform the French army in an enlightened way. So, for instance, he was applying the principle of equality or the advancements based not on money but on merit in the army itself. and that had quite a big impact and will especially have an impact. The rational way of thinking about war, that you have to study war, will be an important factor of his way of waging the war in America, as we will see. So let's go to America with Châtelus. Here you can see the map that is in his travel journal, and so you can see little Châtelus standing looking at the sea during his travels. So of course we have to go back to 1778, the famous date of the treaty between France and America, which is of course a military and commercial alliance in which France promises to help the young United States to fight for their independence. And so we have to of course go straight. There's a lot of other stories to tell in between, but in 1780 the Expédition Particulière starts. So this is that expedition where Rochambeau comes in to the young United States with an army of about 6,000 men, and they're going to fight, of course, alongside George Washington. George Washington is their supreme commander, and so they serve under him, which is important for what I'm going to say later, but so they have to really listen to George Washington, of course, but of course Rochambeau is in charge of his own army. And with him are these three gentlemen. You can see the Baron de Viomesnil, of whom that archive that I recently found is, so the one on the left. His brother was also serving, Le Comte de Viomesnil, and then Chevalier de Châtelus was the third in command here. And so Châtelus was mainly in charge of logistics, but also of the provisions of the French army. And as such, he had to work a lot with the Americans, and he quickly became sort of a liaison officer between the army of George Washington and the army of Rochambeau. One of the reasons is that he was the only of these gentlemen to speak English, because he spoke English very well, as he had been, as we have mentioned very briefly, he was part of the salons in Paris, and he went a lot to England at the time, and befriended people such as David Hume, and so he had learned English because of this reason, which helped him a lot for his reputation here in America. And so Châtelus was in correspondence, as we know, with a lot of people, but one of the highlights of his collection are the 44 letters that he had received from the ambassador, La Luzerne, at his time in America. So between 1780 and 81, they're writing almost every week, which is quite rare. Most of the time people write a little less, but they're in constant correspondence because they have to discuss specifically the finances of the French and American armies, and they have to discuss what they can do in a very complicated campaign, because when the French arrive, there's almost nothing that they can do. They arrive in Newport in July of 1780, and they receive quite a hostile welcome by the American population, based on their previous war where they were enemies, of course, but also based on many cultural, religious, and language differences that will change over time because of lots of new friendships that would evolve. But at the beginning it was a complicated relationship, also because the French considered the American army a little less experienced than they were, and especially way less trained, or they had what you call the army in rags at the time of this alliance, of course. And so Châtelus and La Luzerne had to cooperate, and they had to make sure that the French army would survive financially in the United States, but also that they could actually work with this army. And so the ambassador La Luzerne, just to put him in the context of the other ambassadors, he was the second ambassador. It was called the ministre plénipotentiaire, complicated word, but anyway, and so they were, he was second, and then most people do know Genet too, who came a little bit after him. And so he followed Gérard, who was not popular at all at this time. So he had to get the new place and had to improve the image of the French, and especially show that they were serious, because the campaign before had gone with D'Estaing had gone quite wrong, and so now with Rochambeau they had to show. And so this is the military file of La Luzerne. So it's quite interesting because as an ambassador, as I said, he was also an officer in the French army before joining the diplomatic corps. And so you can read here that he went from a chevau léger de la garde to a colonel du régiment provincial, and so on. And so at one point that regiment got reformed, so it means it kind of got removed, and that's why he joined the diplomatic corps. There's another, like one of the reasons says that he was more interested in this diplomatic relations, but if you look at his file of the 7 Years' War, he was wounded 8 times during the war, and it might just have been that he really didn't want to be in a battle anymore, because it just sounds quite terrible when you read about all his wounds during the 7 Years' War. So yeah, here you can see, so after the 7 Years' War, he became minister plenipotentiary to the Electorate of Bavaria, and then in the United States, and could be surprising, afterwards he became the ambassador for the United Kingdom, so called the Court of St. James, of course, at that time. And so La Luzerne had quite the career, as you can see, and he was related to, for instance, Malesherbes was his uncle, so one of the main philosophers of the Enlightenment, and he was quite similar to Chatelu's background. They had, they had a very similar family background, but also this combination between the Enlightenment and being an officer is also to be found in La Luzerne. So they're both these soldier philosophers of their time. And so what did La Luzerne do here when he arrived? He had a mission, of course, which was leading the Americans to their independence according to the treaty with France in 1778. For that, he had to negotiate a lot with Congress at the time to make sure that all their arrangement would work, but especially also to prevent that the Americans and the British would contract a separate peace. That was one of the main preoccupations of specifically Vergennes, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, that had to be prevented at all cost, because then, of course, they would have lost this entire operation. And then he also had to prosecute a successful war, being that he was in charge of finance and the provisions for the French and also the Continental Army. So, for instance, in 1780, when the time was very hard for Washington's army, he gave a personal loan of 200,000 livres to the Continental Army, which was quite an investment, obviously. But so he gave that kind of money because he really believed in this cause and wanted to make it a success. By working for all these different causes, he was also really a proponent of unifying the United States. In order to fight a war, you need a unified country, of course. And so the states were quite disunited, if that's a word. And so they were it was quite problematic when Luzerne arrived, and he really believed that the United States had to be assembled more. So he was for a permanent continental army, the completion of the Confederation, the sound finances, of course, of the United States in general in order to finance the war, a stronger centralized government for the same reason, and he wanted to have everything more structured. And he actually played an instrumental role in all these elements that I just named because that was needed to wage the war, and he had quite the impact. So that would be definitely another type of lecture to discuss all these different things about La Luzerne, but it's very interesting to look at the correspondence with him and Chatelu because he describes all these different elements during the revolution. And so to go back to the correspondence between Chatelu and La Luzerne, they give an interesting insight in the decision-making process to go to Yorktown. So in historiography, you can read that there are different explanations for the Battle of Yorktown to occur, and especially the choice of going to Yorktown. So you can see that Washington, Rochambeau, and de Grasse are always sort of these three people that have made the decisions. Washington especially was pushing for New York, but switched at one point, might have been caused by Rochambeau, to go to Yorktown, and de Grasse is sort of seen as the person, this is the French admiral of the French fleet that came to Chesapeake Bay, that he made the decision to go to the Chesapeake Bay. There's always debate on who made which decision. I'm not there necessarily to make the ultimate answer, but what is interesting in the letters is that you can see that it's a bit more complex and that it seems like there's especially other people involved, being Chatelu and La Luzerne, but also that it was not that George Washington was completely stubborn, I want to go to New York, and that Rochambeau manipulated him to actually make that move. It just seems like a way more rational, very realistic planning that they did together. Washington was not, sometimes he's portrayed as being a little reckless, like I need to go to New York, but if you read the correspondences closely between all these different people, you find out that it's a bit more sort of a realistic planning, which is what I'll show. So let's go sort of behind the scenes of Yorktown. So during the Hartford Conference in September of 1780, you can see that there's not enough men, not enough money, not enough ships from both sides. So the French army don't have enough, but especially the Americans either. So what Washington and Rochambeau decide is to wait for reinforcement to come from France. They wait for 2,000 more French troops, and they especially wait for the French Navy to arrive. They don't know when they're going to arrive, but they know that if they don't wait for them, they're going to lose anyway. But they still have a plan. They will maybe attack New York. New York is the sort of central symbolic power of Great Britain at the time in America. And so attacking that could be what Washington calls the final blow to win independence. But plan B would be a southern campaign, because it seems like that's an easier option to do. So they don't know what to do yet, but they have two options ready. In the meantime, Châteauroux is in great despair. He is writing that we wanted to crush the English, we thought the occasion favorable, but all in all we have contracted an alliance with rebel subjects. We have to feed, clothe, pay, and even fight for them. So this is of course a desperate moment for him. He's even writing to the king if he can actually go back because of a disease that he does not have, because he just really doesn't believe they can do anything in this situation. He also described his own army as being way too weak to help the Americans. And so he expresses his desperation, but he also has a solution. And one of the solutions is to do research. So as I said, he had this enlightened approach, and in order to fight the war and to make good decisions, he wants to do research. So he wants to research all the different states, and he wants to do that with the officers of Rochambeau and the officers of Washington, and then they want to enlighten the ambassador La Luzerne. One of the main problems is that the ambassador is not informed enough about the French or American situation because he's in Philadelphia and he couldn't travel as much, and so Châteauroux believes he has to be informed in order to make the right decisions, in order to wage the war against the British. And so he will travel with them in a country, see the army, and measure the disposition of the people. And indeed, they're going to do this. So Washington and Rochambeau agree, and he's going to organize this travel. So together with all these different people you can see on the screen, they are going to do this reconnaissance mission, of which they make huge reports. In Châteauroux's archive you can find about 20 reports on each state, on the people that live there, how they can be recruited, how they can be fed, how they can be sort of dragged to the other side if they're if they're loyalist, how they can be convinced, and so on and so on. So they're really studying America in order to know how to fight, who are their allies, who are the enemies, and especially where can we attack. And so they're going to travel through all these different states, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, Massachusetts, and Virginia for about 10 months the whole expedition takes. And so what happens is that the French are always together, but they always join a few of these American people that I discussed in order to show them the country, and especially show them the former battlefields and to introduce them everywhere. So this cooperation leads to a lot of information that they gather, but it also leads to a close cooperation between these French and Americans that was complicated at the beginning, that becomes more easy because they have mutual trust now instead of this distrust from the beginning. And so they come to La Luzerne. So after a few months of traveling, this group, so Châteauroux himself and others, arrive at La Luzerne's place in Philadelphia. And they stay there for 2 weeks. And what's interesting here is that Châteauroux is going to exchange all these new things that they discovered about America. And especially he's discussing that New York is extremely dangerous to attack and that they really should go to the south. So Châteauroux is advising this together with these other people. And so this decision of going to New York or to the south, Châteauroux is really advising to go, as I said, southern to the south there. Lafayette was part of this group as well, as we can see. And so Châteauroux was placed in this apartment of the residence of La Luzerne, and as a little side note, La Luzerne was organizing many balls and dinners and beautiful gatherings in Philadelphia during his period there, and he was organizing specifically one of the first operas in France. So for tonight that could be an interesting parallel to make. But so he was very active in this. And so what's especially interesting is that they're talking a lot and they're inspired, and La Luzerne becomes inspired of this period, of this new idea to go south, really. You can see that. So La Luzerne is writing this to a few people, amongst whom to Châteauroux, where he's writing that we acknowledge the almost unsurmountable difficulty of an attack to New York. So this is already in February, so if you think about the time period, this is really about, 8 months before the actual decisions are made. So they are discussing these options together, and so he even says that some people believe it's a good idea, but some others believe it as a crazy enterprise. He's now talking about members of Congress that he spoke to. He's explaining that. So he's going to write to Rochambeau. La Luzerne writes in March that they should go to the south. I'm not going to read all these different quotes, but I just wanted to show you this is all based on all these different letters that are to be found in Châtelu's archive or in this is in the military archives of France. And so here you can see, of course, that it's your jurisdiction and that of General Washington to make these decisions. He is an ambassador. He cannot give orders, but he says, witnessing the crisis in which the southern states find themselves, I cannot too strongly insist on the necessity of putting ourselves without delay in a state of action. So he's pressing for going to the south to a lot of different people. And also, you can see in April that he is publishing kind of to a lot of different people a report that he made with Châtelu on the southern campaign. This campaign describes in great detail almost all the steps that will be taken later in Yorktown that he wrote on April 20th, and which he sent together with Châtelu to Rochambeau, but also to Washington. And I think that's interesting because the fact that they're all exchanging these ideas means that it's not sort of this manipulation of George Washington to go to to go to Yorktown, but that it's more really a way of just they're keeping him in the loop and they just want to give him different options. And you can see that, well, because for instance here, La Luzerne writes to Washington about it. I'm going to go a bit faster because I'm realizing it goes a bit long. But anyway, La Luzerne here writes, so he writes to Washington, to Rochambeau, but he also writes to De Grasse. So De Grasse is that French admiral that is, of course, the leader of that big fleet that's going to arrive at one point. That's what the French know. They don't know when he arrives or where he will arrive. But La Luzerne is writing to De Grasse as well to press him to go to the south, not to New York, which we can see here too, that he has orders to come to us and to conciliate in advance with me on the operations. So often it's considered that De Grasse on his own made that decision to go to the Chesapeake Bay, but it seems it's more La Luzerne that is behind that and that was pushing him to go there. And he wrote a few letters that actually confirmed this idea. So Châtelu had this sort of idea, he inspired La Luzerne, and then La Luzerne started this whole campaign behind the scenes of pushing for this idea. One of the main reasons was, of course, that otherwise the French would definitely lose again, and that was something that they could not permit to happen. And so here you can see Washington writing to La Luzerne about this idea of the 20th of April that he had sent, and to be sent closer to Rochambeau later, and he said, I very much approve the plan. And then he goes on and on about it, but then he also explains that he will meet Rochambeau in Wethersfield in the 21st of the month. Unfortunately for the French, Washington really wants to go to New York still, but he still there's really this idea of a plan A and a plan B, and if ever the French fleet could arrive in New York, and if ever the States will send more soldiers to New York, they could maybe do it. So you can just feel in all these different letters that he really wants to go to New York, and if ever the conditions are there, they will do it. But there's always, as I'll just go with this, but when Washington is at Wethersfield, he's also considering the second plan still, as Rochambeau is writing about the meeting that they had. So again, there's still two options, and so they don't know yet. So the main decision is they go to New York to really observe closely if they could attack New York or if they have to go to the south. One of the main reasons that the French really want to go to the south is that Lafayette is in danger. Lafayette is, of course, in the Continental Army, but it becomes dangerous for him to be there, and it's hard to maintain the Continental Army's troops, of which he's in charge, in the south. And so there's a real chance that the Continental Army is going to lose the south. So that whole, sort of the whole states of the southern theater, if they lose that, of course, they might really lose the war. And so Lafayette is writing to a few people, amongst whom to Châtelu, in which he expresses his fear. And this is quite the unusual tone for Lafayette, because of course we know him more as this heroic figure. But here to his older uncle, he writes that my ardor creates a strong desire to achieve success, but my self-love makes me tremble at the idea of losing a battle. In a way, my dear Chevalier, that the rank of general that is given to me causes me devilish fear and devilish embarrassment. And so being a commander-in-chief prompted a change in my character. Once I would have dared anything, and today I'm faint-hearted. This is also one of these letters that were from the Châtelu archive. And so I think one of the main reasons that everyone's trying to push for the South is also that, of course, this southern campaign can go wrong. One of the other reasons that really leads to going to Yorktown is, as I said, they go to New York to do the research to figure out, can we attack this? And so in July, at the end of July, Washington, Rochambeau, and Châteauneuf, and many others are organizing what you call a reconnaissance in force mission, in which they observe the situation if they sort of do a fake attack on New York, what the British do, and so they could figure out how many British were there, how the fortifications were laid out, and if it could be a good mission. And so the conclusion of all this is that it was a terrible idea to attack New York. This is one of the reports that I believe is now in the library of Mount Vernon, which is written by Châteauneuf, in which he is strongly advising against. He's putting all the different options of how can we attack New York on 5 different fronts at the same time, and his conclusions every time are, we just don't have enough men. It's impossible to do this. So he always says about it requires much superior means than we have. They're indeed totally outnumbered by the British at this time, and so the conclusion really becomes, if we do this, it's a suicide mission. But so now Plan A, New York, really is starting to fade away. Even George Washington really starts to change his mind already on August 1st, where he can see that he could scarce see a ground upon which to continue my preparations against New York. And therefore I turned my views more seriously than I had before done to an operation to the south. And so one of the main things you read mostly is that 14th of August is the moment when the decision is taken, because that's when de Grasse sends his letters to inform both Washington and Rochambeau that he's going to the Chesapeake Bay, leading to the decision of going to New York. Sorry, I'm saying that wrong again, but to go to Yorktown, because of course the French fleet was needed to block the British army and to win the battle. So that seems to be the motivation. But here you can actually see that Washington was already convinced, obviously the French were too, and so it leads to this decision-making process in which La Luzerne and Châteauneuf were so instrumental. Here we can see de Grasse when he arrived. So he arrived at one point, he's saying, I'm arriving, so it's more like a confirmation that their plan will succeed if they all go to the south. Of course, it's very crucial because if the fleet comes on time, the different land troops come on time, they can encircle Lord Cornwallis in Yorktown, and then, as we know, he could lose there. And so Châteauneuf writes when this decision is really taken to go to Yorktown, he writes to his sister, in which he writes, of course, that if my Lord Cornwallis has forgotten himself in the country, we could very well take him or force him to flee by land with the loss of most of his troops. But to make this decision took many conferences with General Washington, whose interpreter I have always been. And if you read their correspondence, they have met a few times in secret meetings, as they're describing in the different letters. And also Châteauneuf was writing him a lot of the ideas, and he wrote that plan that I had mentioned on April 20th, that plan about the attack of Chesapeake Bay. He actually sent that to Washington as well. Here we can see that Luzerne also writes, a little later, he says, the Count de Grasse had told me upon his arrival on these shores that my urgings had determined him to lead all his forces into the Chesapeake Bay to the aid of Virginia. So this is a letter he wrote to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And so all this led, of course, to the victory at Yorktown, and especially after the victory of Yorktown, of course, leading to the independence of the United States, in which these figures were instrumental. And so this gives us, of course, the question of what was George Washington's role in all this? Well, of course, he was listening to the French, and he was open-minded to the other idea of going to Yorktown. He might have been forced a little bit into it, of course, by all these Frenchmen writing to de Grasse and pushing for that, but at the same time, he was informed of that. He was not put out of that discussion, and especially, he was always considering the plan B of going to the south. And I would say he made a very realistic planning in there. He was ready to listen to advice, which of course, as a great leader, is an important thing to do, but he was also especially willing to change his mind when needed. So that tells us something new, maybe, about George Washington's, or new, it's not, there's a lot of things he showed that in too, but he has a leadership role that he played. And La Luzerne today, of course, that role is a little bit more forgotten, but there's one place in the United States named after him, Luzerne County in Pennsylvania. I don't know if anyone has been there, but what is happening is that in the rotunda of their courthouse, you can see La Luzerne, his painting that has been recently restored. So he's recognized at least there. There's also Lake Luzerne in New York, another place. But so that was the end of the of this presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Iris, for this extraordinarily interesting presentation. And before we open up the floor to the audience, I would like to ask you a silly question. Had you been part of another generation, and you had grown up in Burgundy not 20 years ago, 30 years ago, but 60 years ago, and you had discovered those archives that you discovered in that period, and you had been part of another generation, would you have written the same book? And so it's another way of asking you, if you write that type of history in the same way in 2022 as you would have had in 2020 or in 1980. And that, I think, goes also to Doug in a different way, in how Mount Vernon as an institution not reinvents, because you cannot reinvent history, but revises, casts a different look on that period of American history, but also French history. And what is it, as you know, the brains behind Mount Vernon, that you do to enable each generation to own, in a way, that fundamental part of our common history?
So that's a very interesting question, because of course it's a question relating to historiography and different waves in historiography from, of course, the 1980s up until today. And one of the interesting things of historiography about the French and the American Revolution is that it starts to be actually recognized in the 1980s. But of course the question is relating to the more sort of modern approaches to history that we're in today. And me as a younger scholar, of course you're in the period in which you write, as all historians always do. And so I'm sure it reflects my time period maybe more than the actual history you're discovering, of course, because you have to make choices of what am I going to study, what am I going to write about, and also which discourses of the other historians are you fitting in, or are you writing maybe more against. I've been doing quite the traditional approach of writing a biography, which is maybe not the most, let's say, modern way of doing it, and also describing, of course, the role of a white aristocrat man on top of it all. So that is true that that's quite a traditional figure that I'm studying, but at the same time what I think I can do with Chateauneuf, which is something I haven't discussed at all today because I wanted to focus on the ambassador, La Luzerne, but one of the main things he can teach us is exactly what this time period is very interested in, being, for instance, the role of African Americans in the War of Independence, being the role of women in the War of Independence, but also the role of Native Americans. And I would say that quite reflects our time period we're in today. And Chateauneuf gives very interesting accounts of these different groups and their role in American independence, because he writes about it in his letters and in his travel diary specifically. And so the role of the French, so he's not the only one, a lot of the French officers are discussing these specific engagements in the war that have been quite written out of history and that are coming back today in historiography. And so you can use the French testimonies to reconstruct that role as well. So I am, I think, sort of doing that too, because maybe these specific topics would not have been picked up a few years ago. And in my new book, I'm doing that specifically quite a lot. I'm including that part of history.
Well, thank you very much. It's a wonderful question, and Iris put her finger, I think, on a big portion of it, that historiography changes. The present always is changing, so the questions we ask to the past is always changing. And, both France and the United States have long had very nationalistic traditions in our historiographies, where the United States, in many ways, the tradition of the individual American farmer with a gun who runs out and wins the war for independence. And occasionally, Lafayette might make an appearance, but the good thing about Lafayette is he was an American officer in the American army, whereas the French army, of course, was a whole different thing entirely. And so Lafayette had his place in sort of the traditional narratives, and of course when the Americans enter World War I, it's Lafayette, we have returned. It's not Châteauroux and friends, we're here, And I think that you see that, both in French historiography and the United States, you see opening up a more global turn, an Atlantic turn, with some precedents in the 1960s and earlier. That kind of a North Atlantic Treaty Organization is emerging, and there's more of a willingness to think about shared Atlantic values, but really taking off in the 1990s with the globalization of the way we start thinking of a more diverse history as one aspect of it. And certainly at a place like Mount Vernon, our institution really becomes a research organization around these issues only very recently, only until the creation of this incredible library that was opened in 2013. We really become a patron of research, holding conferences, indeed international conferences. And in fact, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I'm recently back from Spain, where we had an incredible conference in Madrid celebrating the Spanish role in the war for American independence. And of course, the Bourbon Compact, the French and Spanish role are very much intertwined, as they are in a world war against Great Britain together throughout this period. And it's the army marching to Yorktown with Rochambeau is paid by Spanish gold and supported by silver from Havana. And of course, that southern option becomes available because of the success of Bernardo de Galvez in the sack of Pensacola. So there's a broader global aspect to the American War of Independence that only now is really getting a lot of traction amongst American historians. And that, I think, is a great opportunity for us to expand the cast of characters who are critical to that period. And I think Iris's work is exceptional. Of course, as a young woman, she can write about an old dead white man much more easily than I can. I get criticized for that sort of thing, but she gets away with it. I don't know why that would be. But, she's doing an incredible job, as she said, also bringing in the social history aspects of the war, which are more important now as well.
And just to follow up on that question, I mean, in a previous life, I was a professor of American politics, and
me too.
Well, we're brothers in arms, and I think that if you wanted to create in any French university, and I think in a lot of American universities, a class in military history, where you would teach the Battle of Yorktown or other battles, it's like I would probably get 3 undergrads and 1 stray cat, and that's it. So it's like, and even diplomatic history is making a comeback. But I would like you to both address that genre issue of in terms of the various types of history that we teach, because to me it's absolutely essential that we are able to pass the message to the next generations, and that's after all what writing history is all about. I mean, is passing a message, but also of generations owning and appropriating that part of their common history.
Well, I'll start. I'll let Iris, who's more in tune with the effort to teach in universities. I was the chair of the history department at SUNY Binghamton University before I came to Mount Vernon in 2013, and we had a tremendous, incredible group of historians there. But I will say, in the last 25 years in the United States, there's fewer and fewer people being trained in military history and diplomatic history, particularly those two. And there's fewer and fewer courses offered in those areas, which, traditionally would attract, probably more men to come to these classes, college men to come to a military history class, and that sort of thing. But I think we're in danger of not teaching that enough right now, and diplomatic as well. And so there's a lot of, I think, naivete about the world in the educated population of the United States generally. And it is an area where we should be emphasizing and helping to support and patronize new work that, of course, speaks to a modern audience, which brings in the social history of war as well as the tactics and the social history of diplomacy as well. But honestly, it was very difficult for me to get other professors to teach these classes, not because they wouldn't fill. I think they would fill, and I think if you look at the declining majors in history throughout the American Academy, a lot of that has to do with the fact that professors are teaching classes nobody wants to take, and they're very obscure. I'll do one example. I had a professor who wanted to teach her own dissertation research was based on the history of the body, cultural history, really wonderful, brilliant stuff, the history of the body in Southeast Asia. And I said, well, could you teach a class on the history of India, or Gandhi's India, or diplomacy in India? And I think that would fill. But this other class on the history of the body, nobody would take it, because nobody knows what that is. If you're an undergraduate, what is the history of the body in Southeast Asia? That doesn't sound appealing. So she got 6 people to sign up for the class. So I do think that professors need to be asked to think about ways that they can serve the public as well as serve their own research interests. So, I mean, that may be a bit jaded of a remark, but I'll hand it to Iris to cover for me.
All right, I'll try. So personally, because I've been teaching in France for about 9 or 10 years at Sciences Po, where you always also were, of course. But so, and Benjamin Bernard is here, my colleague. And so we were teaching about, specifically, was one of the classes, just as an example, was the long 19th century, and we would combine military history in it in order to make that relevant, but in a larger context. Not to have just one thing about battles and the generals, but to make it more embedded in history, because of course you can't talk about the 19th century or our century or even today without talking about the wars you're in and the geopolitical or maybe more political consequences of them. And personally, in the book I'm writing today, is I'm combining military history with social history and cultural history, because by doing so, you make something a bit more, it's more interesting than just talking about a battle, but also, for instance, what I try to show with Chateauneuf and La Luzerne and these others is that they have this enlightened approach to warfare. So you combine the cultural, intellectual approach to warfare and thus make it maybe a bit more interesting, or at least also relevant, because, for instance, one of the main things that was the influence of the military enlightenment is that, so that's how you call this sort of approach between the Enlightenment and military, is that it had a huge impact on politics at the time. So you can show all these different links between different aspects of war that are not in isolation. And I think that's the way maybe to do it today.
Yeah. So, in a way, global history or connective history.
Yeah.
Turning to a completely different issue and returning to your presentation this afternoon, I was struck by how you insisted on various participants to that debate on whether to go to Yorktown in New York, saying we have to save the South in a way. It's the southern states that are the most at risk. And I would like to ask you both again how that will color in the decades after the position of France towards what is going to happen almost a century later, which is the Civil War. That is to say, we all know that around 1860-61, France was not completely on one side. And so I was really interested in how this sympathy for the South, which you really clearly showed, informed what was going to happen
in the relations between the two countries for the century to come.
So in the different letters you can read about this specific topic of saving the South, let's say. I'm not sure it was really relating to sympathy for the South more than just losing another theater of the war. Because of course you had sort of the different theaters. If they would lose the South on top of their others, it might have become a very complicated war to win. At the same time, what's interesting about some of the participants, the French participants, such as Chateauneuf, is that they're writing about the division that they can see between the different states, and especially the differences in culture and the differences in their approach to slavery. And Chateauneuf himself is actually predicting that there will be such a big gap between the North and the South that it will lead automatically to a civil war, which he is writing in the 1780s. And he's not the only one, by the way, writing this. Not that he is this sort of, he sees the future. Of course, a lot of others see these big differences too, but I think that's an interesting part, is that it's to be observed already that this big difference between the different states is one of the reasons for a division at the end.
It's a very big question about the sympathies of different regions. The French sympathy to the South, part of that you see reflected in the sort of Jeffersonian movement of the 19th century. Their sympathy towards France, their antagonism to England, is sort of a common ground that's developed. And that's really developed out less of this war for independence, but more out of the political responses to the wars of the French Revolution. First the Revolutionary Wars, and then even the Napoleonic Wars, of course. And then, of course, you have French speakers in Louisiana, and you have relations there that go, towards the French Caribbean as well as, to Europe. And so, I think the geopolitical concern and dislike of the English had as much to do with, in what regions in the United States you see more French sympathy and American French sympathy. So I think it's a long, complicated tale, but you do see a lot of French sympathy towards the South because there was a lot of Southern love for the French, whereas New England, particularly Protestant New England, they tended to be more British inclined, Anglo inclined, and aggressively anti-Catholic as well, in a way that you see a little more enlightened ideals in some cases in the Jeffersonian South, in the enlightened South. So I think that's more where you see it. I think Iris covered the South is where the British Army is more exposed. They're protected in New York. There's no way to get at them. Manhattan's a fortress at this point, and without a navy, there's no assaulting it at all. One of the anecdotes, though, that Iris you should have shared, was when Rochambeau and Washington were doing these reconnaissance in force. And there was one time they went out on a particular little peninsula and had a picnic and probably a few glasses of French claret. Then the tide came in, and they got trapped on this little island. These two great generals, they fell asleep, dreaming of conquest with a wonderful Bordeaux. And they could have been captured. There was a British little guys in rowboats going at the island when they were plucked off it by some Americans or French sailors, I don't even know which. But that would have been an ignominious end to these two great generals. We wouldn't be talking about them today if they had been captured that day during their reconnaissance in force.
Wonderful anecdote. Let's open it to your questions, and I hope there are many that we can take. Sir?
You talked about how they've done the reconnaissance in New York and realized that was hopeless. Did they, and that program's now running, and talked about Washington's great interest in intelligence gathering. Did they know that Cornwallis was moving or had moved into Yorktown and would be particularly vulnerable there? Or did they really just know that Cornwallis was there and was an opportunity to strike a blow against the British that might be a major strategic move?
So when they were doing the reconnaissance, they did know that Cornwallis was based there and that they had a force that was way less numerous than what they had in New York. So there was that knowledge, but the intelligence came quite at the same time that he had given the orders to go to Yorktown and to kind of fortify that place. And so they were, when they heard that, they knew this is the trap we need. So the information came by letters. Letters could take a week or 5 weeks sometimes, so it was very complicated to get the information soon. So for instance, when De Grasse came and won the battle in September 5th, of course, the Chesapeake Bay. Yeah, the Battle of the Capes. The Washington and Rochambeau know about it only 9 days later, just to realize about this distance at the time, and not to talk about how long it took to go to France with letters, of course. But anyway, yeah, they did know. A lot of information came through different channels. One of the main channels was Lafayette himself, who wrote a lot of letters about this.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is that Lafayette, of course, is with an army of about 2,000 men, sort of nipping at the heels of Cornwallis as he's all throughout. He can't get in a general engagement because he doesn't have enough men, and that's partly what in that letter that he writes to Châteauneuf is the context of, like, he doesn't want to get his whole army captured. And he describes himself, I think, like a little dog nipping at the heels of a larger dog. And so it is a dramatic moment. But I do think of the fog of war. They have no idea where this fleet is going to end up and whether it will show up, when it will get there. They don't know exactly the state of the army. And so the obsession with intelligence gathering reflects the fact that nobody knew what was going on anywhere. You couldn't just pick up the phone and call Governor Nelson in Richmond and be like, hey, what's going on down there? So it is a remarkably different context.
Ma'am?
So I wanted to just say how much I admire your work, Iris, and to say that it not only took being in the right place at the right time and a passion for history to make these discoveries, but it's amazing how much you have discovered in such part of your life, probably more than many people discover in a lifetime, but that it took all of these skills of detective work to discover them, to track down these different parts of archives in very different places, and also to take a look at the people who weren't so much well known. They were figures even in portraits and other documents that we have. But what do you think was it that inspired your detective abilities to pull all these things together?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question is, sorry? Yes.
That's what we're going to
yeah. So it was about the sort of the detective skills that I have developed over time and where that comes from. And I would say just it was curiosity because of that tree. It sounds a little, it's not the most like revealing or anything, but that was really it. It was just a question that I was asking myself. And I think the main driving force is just curiosity of what is this story, and I don't know, making connections maybe that maybe are not that obvious, but if you're somewhere you read about Châteauneuf, it's like, hey, that village. So it's just intuition, I guess, that is there. And then from that discovery of Châteauneuf, I got kind of more into the detective thing of, I'm sure there's more to find. And one of the reasons Kevin Butterfield, who was the director of the library of Mount Vernon first, he was asking, like, is there more? He was inspiring me actually to be like, yeah, actually, is there more? And so I thought about Vieux-Munich already a long time because the letters that I had seen between him and Châteauneuf, and I was like, I'm sure there must be something. It's not possible that that's gone because it was just too much. And so indeed, I found it in another place called Le Creusot, known for the pots and pans of Le Creuset, these orange French things you all know. But because I just had a feeling that it must be there, and I'm on the track of another one because I met someone who apparently was descendant of de Kalb. So maybe he said he had a big collection, so going there soon. Yeah, because this is now how it will go, I guess. It's like just being at the right place sometimes and then following up. And for the Châteauneuf part, it was also part of negotiating with that family because they were not that eager. Philippe was happy that I was there to study it or to explore the collection, but his brother and another brother were actually very reluctant because they were afraid I was going to reveal the negative stories about their family. One of the reasons is quite funny is that the Châteauneuf family is still today a royalist family, and François-Jean Châteauneuf is, according to them, a socialist, and they just don't like him. And so that was one of the reasons they were reluctant. But it took about 3 years from that first discovery to actually getting into the archive. And the same for the digitization. As Doug knows very well, it just took a very long time. So it's also about perseverance, I would think.
Iris is being very humble. I mean, she really, let's give her a big round of applause. This is amazing. Amazing stuff. Now, we're not being recorded here, right? We're not, so when we were negotiating with Hugues de Châteloup at the Jockey Club in Paris, and I sadly do not speak French, so Iris was my Châteloup translating, and I was getting very passionate, and it was this incredible meal that kept coming with a new bottle of wine with every course of the meal, and I think there were cigars at some point. I remember like banging on the tables, like, translate that, Iris, we have to do this. And then COVID and all this, but it is really remarkable that we're able to announce that incredible partnership now so that all scholars can come and use this archive.
A provocative personal question. Had your home been in Burgundy, but had you discovered archives having to do with the war in Indochina, would you have become a specialist of what we call la guerre d'Indochine and what became the Vietnam War?
Possibly. But
No,
I don't know, but I have to say that it was really a personal sort of, because I just read that travel journal, that was really the click.
Okay.
The tree was a click, but also that travel journal, because he's describing these young United States in a way that is very lively and interesting and shows that the beginnings of the United States, which were just of interest to me personally too. So I got
Sir?
inspired. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is about the impact of the American War of Independence on the French Revolution, or at least on France in general. I have to admit that I didn't hear the sort of middle part of the question, but the second part was about the financial impact of the American Revolution in France. So there are a few things here to discuss, because the first one would be that the impact of the American Revolution on France was indeed the financial crisis in which France, of course, was just after the American campaign, in which they spent so much money that their treasuries were empty, which they already were, by the way, before joining the campaign. But so the campaign in America really was one of the final hits of the finances of France, combined with many other factors, of course, leading to the French Revolution. Another factor that is lesser studied or lesser acknowledged is that some of the French officers that came back to France were inspired by this American Revolution. Even if most of them were really not, they were just serving their king and just fighting a war, some of them, such as our friend Châteloup, was very inspired. He even wrote a book in 1788, which he never finished because he suddenly passed away during the writing process, but it's in the archive now, and so it's a huge book, or at least a sort of a structure he wrote for it, that describes his hopes for reforming France based on an American example. So he's discussing constitutionalism, he's discussing the abolition of privileges based on this American system, a tax revision, sort of a reform of the taxes. So he really wants to reform France, and he says he wants to create an evolution instead of a revolution for France. So I would say that's quite an impact of that.
Madam in the back.
My question is about the presence of the word happiness. It shows up in our Declaration of Independence. And then also Châteauneuf's writing about happiness. If you could clarify a little bit how life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness shows up in the Americas, but in Enlightenment philosophy in Europe, usually they're like liberty and property. Is there a connection there? Could you speak to that a little bit more?
Yes. So the first question could be, was Châteauneuf so influential that he inspired Jefferson to write these words? I would say no. But so he wrote this book about public happiness. It was this whole story of how are the people most happy under which type of government, which was a very widespread theme of the time of the Enlightenment, of course. So there were many others before him and also after him that wrote about the same principles, but it was, you could say, in the air, and he was one of the first to actually write purely and only about happiness. So that was his sort of specialty in this field. But of course he was mainly inspired by many others, such as John Locke or David Hume, and especially in his case Helvétius, who is a not that known French philosopher, who he quotes. He doesn't necessarily plagiarize or anything, but he quotes him a lot. And so this was one of the main themes of the Enlightenment, of course, but he was recognized as being an influential thinker at his time, and especially of this idea of that a government should give the greatest happiness to the largest amount of people, the largest number of people. That's a phrase that you can see, for instance, in Jeremy Bentham after Châteauneuf. So it could be an influence that he had, but at the same time, there's many other influences too. So I always have a problem of saying that's his influence, but you can just say that he's representing his time period. You could say the zeitgeist of the time that was representing, of course, this quest for happiness. And one of the reasons Jefferson invites him at Monticello is to talk about that concept. So they are having exchanges about the concept of happiness at the time.
I'm very happy to extend this a little bit longer. I just want to also tell you that we'll be saying a few words towards the end on the what's to come, and because this is not an end project. And so what I suggest is maybe we take 3 questions and we take them together, and then we can maybe package them, if you will. Madam.
My name is Contessa Boyone. I'd like to ask, how much the French government related with the American Revolution, how did it change the course of American or West American?
All right. Sir?
Yes, my question is a little more military history oriented or military based on my background. In the letter between all these leading figures, was there ever discussion of the risk involved in the decision to move south? Because Washington left invading force just to fix Clinton on the deal.
Sir?
The word independence is staring at all of us. This is the national myth of the United States, that we did this ourselves, that we were independent. But of course we weren't. We were completely dependent on help from France and Spain. And I wonder, from all 3 of you, what opportunity you see as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence to try to change how Americans understand the war, to help them understand that we have never been independent in the way that we imagine. We've always been interdependent, and we rely more than anyone on France.
All right. You had a question too. No, you. Yeah. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, let's take those 3 questions.
Yeah, so I would say we could combine well, let's just start with the French aid. So the French aid and how important, let's say, it was, or what the main contribution was, that's quite a large question, so I'll try to make it short. But the French aid was crucial for American independence in a way that the king sent his army, but also a lot of money. That was mainly it, especially before Rochambeau came and even before D'Estaing, the other general, came. There was a lot of secret aid, what you call. So they sent arms, ammunition, and money to the Americans in the first stage. The second stage is the military alliance, after which they sent their troops and more money, and especially their navy. Without specifically the French Navy, they could not have won, because the British Navy was so powerful that without having a sort of an equal navy, they could not have won this war. So that would answer it, but it was also a combination with the Spanish and we always forget, but the Dutch were there too with the financial aspect.
That was well answered. I'll go with I have a lot to say about the second question, but the last one, I think, about the independence and independence. And I think that the United States needs to constantly remind ourselves that we've always needed allies to succeed. And certainly that's a critical part of understanding the success of the war for American independence. the arms, the clothing, the military support, the financial support. But this was, support given because the French and the Spanish and the Dutch had their own interests as well. So all these countries happened to share an interest in this moment that the movement for American independence was able to take advantage of and use to great advantage. And so I do think that the general American understanding of the war is certainly completely foolish if they don't understand the context of the great support of Spanish and French and Dutch and others. But also Native American alliances were critical as well in the context of that story. And I do think part of the work we've been doing and part of the stories that institutions like Mount Vernon, the Museum of the American Revolution, many others, the stories we're going to be telling are going to help Americans, I think, see that war in a bigger global context. Sadly, sometimes when you talk about the global aspects of the war, the importance of the American Army dwindles to a very minuscule aspect. But I would say the independence of the United States was a world-shifting, transformational event. Whereas the 70,000 troops that died in India and the many others who died at the Siege of Gibraltar had their roles to play and important roles to play. But one of the great consequences of that global war was the independence of the United States.
And I'd like to also mention that this global aspect, there's a few people here, is the Washington-Rochambeau Revolutionary Route, which is a very important route that goes from Newport to Yorktown that symbolizes this cooperation between the French and Americans. And there's also a large effort from them to emphasize on this global aspect and especially this cooperation with the French, but also the lesser known stories of, as I've said it already, the African American participation or Native Americans or women and those living along the trail, so the local population that was also instrumental in winning this war. So there are lots of efforts done to tell this story, and for the 250th, all these efforts will be combined, I hope, to make it more known and more recognized by.
And the trail speaks to the risk of the move south.
Oh yeah, the move south. So part of this trail, obviously, was this decision to go south. And it's true that the question asked was about the risks of the South. Like, were they aware of these huge risks? And one of the main reasons that Washington did not want to go to Yorktown, as he also said after Wethersfield, there's a few letters in which he's putting a serious question, because he says going to the South is going to be so dangerous for all these people that have to march because of the dangers of the diseases that will be in the South, the hot climate, all these mosquitoes and all these different dangers that they would have, but also the roads that were almost inexistent. Bridges had to be built, the different woods had to be cleared before the army could actually go. And the idea was to bring a few by ship, but unfortunately there were not enough ships. And so this campaign was considered almost too dangerous. That is true. Luckily, some people had prepared this road a little bit more in advance, so they knew that they could do it, but it was a huge risk. But apparently they had to take it because otherwise there was no other option. And I'm sure you have some more, maybe.
Well, the most important thing about the march south is when they stopped at Mount Vernon, which I encourage everybody to visit. They were there for 3 days, and it's an incredible story.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Chateauneuf was there with Washington, so yeah.
And to the gentleman's question on interconnectedness and the fact that the United States was never truly independent.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Yeah, that was right.
I spoke to that. The importance of allies have been a critical lesson that needs to continually be told. And we see now that, look at the Ukrainian struggle for their own independence right now. They've been independent for 30 years. But this is their war of independence, and they rely on lots of friends and lots of support. But also, it's the heart and leadership and fighting spirit of the Ukrainian people that is the critical factor. And I think that was the case with the American army as well. If there wasn't any Washington, it wouldn't have mattered how many French guns came.
All right. Well, Iris, what's next?
What's next?
Yeah.
In the program today, you mean? Or,
The program today, I think we're coming to the end.
Yeah,
But what's
or for
next
me.
in our projects? I mean, you know, I would like
Yeah.
to
So we can-
you
yeah, we
to
can
address
announce,
the issue of America 2026, for example.
yes, so the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution will be celebrated in 2026, so after 1776. And so together with Vincent and the team of the CNRS here in the embassy, and together with French professors, but especially it's a European group, we're going to organize a series of conferences to discuss this European role in the American Revolution and what we have said, this more global approach to the revolution, in a series of many conferences going to travel through the different consulates here in the United States. And it's a joint program with the European universities, so there are going to be about 20 conferences in general, and they will be divided between the United States and Europe. To approach or to put the European and American scholars together, because often they're working separately. So now we want to join the forces, let's say, to talk about these new historiographies that will be needed now in this time to discuss the more diverse stories of the American Revolution and the more global approach to it. So we are going to launch this in December here at the embassy again. So hopefully you can be there then.
We're absolutely delighted to support the effort, and the French Embassy, the Cultural Services are fully behind this project, and which is a work of love and labor between France and the United States. And I think that's a fitting conclusion for tonight. And I really want to thank Iris, Doug, for very insightful presentations and responses to our audience's question. Thank you.
Thank you.